Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 10 of Across the Board. Across the Board is a podcast on boards of directors, corporate governance, risk management, and strategic use of risk, all focused at the board of directors level. Today I have back with me Sheila Hooda. Sheila is an independent, non-executive board member with over 30 years of operating experience at the executive and C-suite level. She has provided strategic direction, driven growth, and transformed Fortune 500 companies. She currently serves on the board of directors for the Mutual of Omaha Insurance Company, serving on the risk and investment committees, also on the board of Virtus Investment Partners, a leading investment management firm. She is the CEO and president of Alpha Advisory Partners, an advisory firm providing strategic M&A and turnaround counsel for financial and business service companies. Today we have a very interesting exploration of culture at the board level and why culture at the board level is so important to culture in an organization. We discuss how a board can focus on culture, how it can manage culture, and how it can lead in building an ethical culture within an organization. I think whether you're on the board, or the C-suite, or other level, you'll find this a fascinating podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode of Across the Board. Across the Board is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, back again for another episode of Across the Board. Today I have back with me Sheila Hooda. Sheila is a board member from various boards and an expert on corporate governance, and she has taken the time to visit with us today on what I think is not only a fascinating topic, but one that is incredibly important, which is the board's focus on corporate culture. So we're going to try to unpack that. Sheila, with that short introduction, thank you, and thank you for taking the time to visit with us today.
My pleasure, Tom. Thank you.
So I realize there's, when you say board culture or corporate culture and the board's role in corporate culture, it could be a wide variety of things. But let me just sort of start out with an opening question or maybe even observation. I've been privileged to go in front of several boards, and the reaction I get from board members can be as wide as very intent on listening to what I had to say, engaged with what I was presenting on. Lots of questions. Obviously, they'd read the material, down to what I would call sort of a high school student council meeting board, where people were talking, they were looking at their cell phones, they were engaged in many things other than my presentation. And it made me wonder how serious they were about my report to them. And I guess that would lead me to just ask the basic question, what do you see as good board culture?
Hello?
Yes?
Yes, sorry, go ahead.
What do you see as good board culture, and does good board culture, in your opinion, lead to good corporate culture?
That was a great lead-in, Tom. Let me just start with what is corporate culture? How is it commonly defined? It's really a set of shared values, beliefs, and behaviors within the company. But why is this important? And the reason is culture is really the unifying force. I use this word unifying force within the company, and it's strongly rooted in what I would call integrity, ethics, and social responsibility. With this context, culture really provides the framework for behavior that aligns the company towards generating long-term shareholder value. However, an important point to remember, culture is not a soft issue. It has concrete impact, and its strengths or weaknesses is really what aligns with organizational performance and reputation. And because of this, because culture is linked with and drives organizational performance and reputation and success, it is inextricably linked with the company's strategy, its risk management, its CEO hiring, its talent development. And because of that, it is a key board responsibility, a full board responsibility. Now, Tom, I'm going to come back more specifically to your question. But once we have established that culture is a full board responsibility, and we see the continuing and very, very visible fallout of what I call corporate disasters or scandals. In the 90s, it was the accounting scandal. In the mid-2000s, you had the financial crisis. More recently, we've had issues with Wells Fargo, Uber, Volkswagen, all of which accentuate how unhealthy cultures pose a significant risk to companies and their reputation and their bottom line. And when you look at the external environment with all its threats, demographics, technology, cyber, investor scrutiny, changing customer preferences, an unhealthy culture with such a big external disruptive environment only makes the company more fragile or vulnerable to poor performance. Therefore, good corporate culture is really a core strategic asset of a company. It's an important competitive advantage. It needs focus, it needs investment, it needs continual improvement, both on the part of management and the board. And therefore, directors need to elevate their dialogue around risk to strengthen board oversight of this important risk area. Now, after this introduction that I've given about what is corporate culture, why it is so important and an area for the full board to focus on, Tom, your point that boards were distracted and not paying attention when you talk to them about risk and compliance is really a scary point. It shows an uneven or a lack of completely engaged or focused board. It also means that the board doesn't realize how important their role is in establishing a culture, and a culture that seeps in from the bottom up, from the bottom downward. It's a top-down approach and engagement for good oversight.
So you really gave us a lot to talk and think about there, Sheila, and frankly, in ways that I had not considered. But let me maybe just start with kind of a basic inquiry to you. How does the board begin to think through the oversight? And I guess what struck me was your affirmation that corporate culture is a key or core strategic asset that needs continual improvement as in what I would call just a standard business process. But you've taken that to the level of the corporate culture needs that kind of attention as well.
Exactly. And it's this lack of recognition, I feel, in the past about corporate culture that has accounted for and caused a lot of the scandals and debacles and poor management that we have seen. So let me share with you, some of the ways in which a board can provide better oversight of this key strategic asset or strategic risk of a company. I'd like to break it up into what I call three broad areas. One is how does the board manage their culture? How does the board provide that oversight within the boardroom by setting the foundation and the context? The second point I want to discuss briefly is how does the board convey and manage this oversight across the organization? And the third is how does the board manage this oversight and convey it to the shareholders, the ultimate owners of the company? So, within the boardroom, which is our focus area of what boards should be doing as they provide oversight for corporate culture, it's clearly a full board responsibility because it is inextricably linked with strategy and risk and long-term value creation. I mean, we've established that in my earlier discussion. And the first way the board can do this is by setting up and clearly delineating the responsibilities in board policy documents and the charter, sort of setting the foundation for what is accepted behavior across the entire organization and across all geographies. The second is, now, while we've established it is a full board responsibility, how does the board manage it? And that is really through the committee structure. So we'll talk about the three main baselines, the core committees: the audit committee, the compensation committee, and the norm and gov committee. The board will sort of bring this as a full board responsibility. It will establish it as part of their policy and documents, and then each committee will sort of manage it through their lens of responsibilities. So the audit committee will do it through internal and external audit, controls, compliance, risk management, but all with corporate culture embedded and running through each of these areas. Compensation is something very, very important, especially after we've seen the Wells Fargo blow up and a lot of the financial crisis blow up, largely coming from the whole pay philosophy, the design of incentive plans, performance evaluation, leadership development. These are all areas that the compensation committee can very, very tightly focus on and manage and sort of provide oversight for. This will include things like, regularly keeping hotlines open, regularly checking the feedback that comes in through the hotline, listening to whistleblowers, paying attention to exit interviews, because these are ways in which you get a sense and you keep a pulse on the culture. And the last is the Norm and Gov Committee, which really sets the operating principles and policies, the board composition, the succession plans, the diversity and inclusion at the board level. So the point here is it's a top-down responsibility stemming from the board, which manages it through specific board committee oversight. Now, going to the next point is across the organization. How does the board provide oversight for culture across the organization? And that is really by providing oversight of how management manages culture. First is the importance of embedding culture into the strategy, risk, and performance discussion. The message here is really achieving goals, achieving results, but also equally important is how things are achieved. how results are achieved. For instance, unethical behavior is not acceptable. Zero tolerance for that. Workplace harassment, workplace toxic cultures, not acceptable. Zero tolerance for that. So it's embedding culture with management in all the strategic, risk, and performance discussion. In line with this, how do you assess the company's culture? You have the information coming in from management through surveys, through discussions and interviews, but this needs to be balanced with both the internal feedback you get as well as what I would call external feedback, third-party assessments, third-party benchmarks and surveys. So you're balancing the information you get both internally and externally, and it's both qualitative and quantitative. And it's done regularly so that it flows up to the board and to the senior most level of management on a regular level, regular time frame, so that they can keep a pulse on what I call the health, the culture and health of the organization, so that any red flags are very quickly noticed. And the case in point here is Wells Fargo, correct? There were instances when there were issues that came up regarding incentives and sales practices at Wells Fargo, but these red flags were not given adequate attention. The health, the culture and health of the organization was not tested. There was not an adequate focus on the pulse of the organizational health in terms of culture. So that's the second point. The third point is really establishing roles, responsibilities, and reporting. And in this context, individuals in roles like the chief legal officer, the compliance officer, the audit officers, these people need to have their roles that are well positioned to support the culture. So they need to be adequately empowered and have the visibility to escalate and notice red flags, as well as the sensitivity to observe it, because sometimes you may not know that something is a red flag. So it's training for people who are in these sort of positions where they can observe and be empowered to escalate these red flags. And the fourth point in terms of embedding the culture across the organization is the CEO selection and the C-level. It should be an explicit criteria that if a company has a certain culture, the CEO is someone who is a flag bearer for that culture. It's part of his responsibility, both in terms of leadership development as well as succession planning. And my last point is how does the board manage culture? I would say the last one is shareholder communication. The dialogue with the shareholder, or if it's not dialogue, it could be verbal or written communication, but to inform them that the company they're investing in pays a lot of attention and focus to the corporate culture because it's a key strategic asset. It is valued, it is managed well, and there are always efforts to monitor it and improve it. So in a nutshell, the board manages it through its internal processes and policies and committees. It embeds it across the organization in terms of strategy, risk and performance discussion, reporting, and CEO selection. And thirdly, by managing it and communicating this management of this key asset to its shareholders. So, because corporate culture is such an important asset, the point I'm conveying is it is a full board responsibility that is serious and needs to be comprehensively provided with oversight and monitoring.
Sure. One of the things, or rather, you've written about, I think, and spoken extensively about engaging investors for long-term value creation. And indeed, this year you've written an article for the NACD Directorship magazine on that topic. And one of the things I've heard you consistently talk about is the need for communication with a wide variety of stakeholders. Obviously, shareholders or stakeholders in a corporation, but you really advocate a broader view, including customers, including employees, the community, and supply chain and third parties. Do those views hold for communication and in discussions around corporate culture as well?
In terms of corporate culture, now with shareholders, you will communicate to them via your financial documents in your annual and quarterly reports and presentations. However, with your employees, with your customers, with your supply chain, it is really what I would call action. You're talking about ethical behaviors. You're talking about fair pricing. You're talking about treating employees well. You're talking about a good workplace environment. You're talking about not misleading customers with reference to your product or the sourcing of that product. So when you talk of your broader range of stakeholders, culture is something that embodies ethics and integrity and social responsibility. And that goes beyond just communicating them and convincing them. There, you're proving it in word and deed and action. So, it's a very comprehensive, holistic approach that you take to be a good corporate citizen. Obviously, your shareholders have a financial stake, but all these other stakeholders need to be adequately empowered, engaged, and happy with you, because what I call any imbalance across the entire stakeholder ecosystem will not, at some point, will come back to haunt the company. And we've seen it all over the place. Wells Fargo, Uber, where else? The Harvey Weinstein Company, Volkswagen, Enron. I mean, the whole ecosystem has to be well balanced.
Sheila, let me change the focus just a bit because I've been intrigued by the following point. I think our listeners would understand you're female, also that you had some education outside of the United States. So that would lead me to say you have diversity and you bring that experiences from both of those areas to the board of directors that you sit on. Do you think having someone who's not a white male who's 60 is important around culture as well?
The answer to that is a resounding yes, Tom. And the reason is the more viewpoints you get, the richer your discussion, the broader your considerations, the deeper your sensitivity. And I could say for myself, I didn't grow up in this country. I came from India, from a developing country. I saw the end state of various supply chains. A lot of retail and apparel is sort of created and developed in those countries. Some of the supply chain situations are terrible. You try to manage costs, but it's the ultimate worker who is treated poorly, who doesn't get fair wages, who doesn't get vacation, doesn't get health care. And that is not sustainable long term. Nor is it sustainable if you have an environment where 50% or 40% of your employee base is living in fear of threat, or they have lack of promotion opportunities or biases against them. Because ultimately, it's the organizational that will suffer. You won't get the best talent. You're not leveraging capabilities. So this is why I think having more people around the boardroom with different, whether it's age or ethnicity or gender or education, they bring a broader, deeper perspective to the discussion and sensitivities, which ultimately enrich the company. And that reflects in the bottom line. So it's a win-win for everybody, even though at some stages it may seem you're making trade-offs. When you run a corporation, you're thinking long-term, and it's a long-term win that is the most desirable outcome.
So let me turn now to, if I could, some of the specific information that you as a board member might ask from a chief legal officer, a chief compliance officer, even a CEO. You spoke about employee surveys and other broad-based forms of communication. But one of the things I'm intrigued about is really the two-way communication from someone like myself, who may be more of a chief compliance officer, to someone like yourself on the board, and then also the communication back down to me. Could you give us a few thoughts on what you would expect there?
Transparency, accountability, and in alignment, correct? So whether it is the board that is focused on the overall organization, or a compliance officer who has a specific mandate, I believe it should be a two-way communication that is fully transparent, and if necessary, it can be real time. It does not have to be every quarter or every 6 months. If there is something out there that is happening that is a red flag, I think that escalation process needs to be immediate. And I believe, especially if you're, in audit or risk or compliance, it is the empowerment and visibility of those individuals. And that is why I use those points: well positioned to support the culture, because they need to be empowered to sort of immediately escalate it and bring about what you may call a constructive, immediate solution to the problem before it festers and gets out of control, and before the press gets on your case, etc. Transparency, accountability, and alignment.
Sheila, one of the other points from your NACD directorship article that particularly struck me is that this is not a one-time conversation, a one-time view, a snapshot, that you really view all of this, as you said earlier, holistically, but also each conversation sets the stage for a future conversation. And so that it's an ongoing dialogue, it's an ongoing feedback loop, it's an ongoing process. And you even used the word, when you started, really a continual improvement of corporate culture. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, exactly. Because the environment is changing. And what was perhaps either a threat or a risk that didn't exist before, suddenly is a burning issue, correct? And we learn as we go along. And maybe 20 years ago, there was not as much sensitivity. It was bad that there wasn't, but there wasn't. And time has passed. But workplace culture and workplace environment were not considered big issues. Today, they're viewed as strategic assets. It's because our thinking has evolved. We've learned along the way. And we have now, I think, boards and management has come to accept that until every part of the stakeholders within that go to make up a company are balanced, the ecosystem is thriving and balanced, the long term, there can be no long-term gain. So it's a process of evolution, and maybe 50 years from now or 30 years from now, we will have further evolved. But boards, at least because of their responsibility and because of their top-down tone at the top, responsibility they have for the long-term value creation of a company, it is part of their mandate or responsibility to constantly seek to evolve, to improve, to make things better.
So, Sheila, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time. This has just been a fascinating discussion, and I really hope the listeners understand. I'm going to go back to really what you started with, that culture is a core strategic asset that needs continual improvement. And I've never heard it articulated in quite that way as the core strategic asset. And by moving it and even using that terminology and moving it to the board level, you've placed it front and center, not for a one-time look, not for an annual assessment, not for a one-time survey, but really, as you said, an ongoing dialogue, an ongoing conversation, and continually improving it.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for encapsulating it so eloquently, Tom. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Across the Board. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast. As it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about this most unique podcast, which focuses on board of directors, governance, risk management, and strategic use of risk at the board of directors level. I hope you will join us again next time for another episode of Across the Board. Across the Board is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.